welcome back to another episode of Pop Culture Therapy.
I'm Advent Nebula.
I'm Cruellica Kain, and we are here today with the therapy chair session that we're just going to kind of get right to it on horror.
Exactly, and what we're going to be focusing on is what your tastes in horror and your tastes in some of the way you digest horror, whether it be for movies, TV, books, or music, tells you what it is about yourself that you're going to discover.
So, kind of defining horror. I know it's so obvious to many people that horror is something scary. But what a lot of people forget, horror is so much more than just the fear factor. It's the way the story is told, it's the way the story is presented, and it's the way the characters kind of drive the path to a conclusion, be it good, bad, or otherwise.
Exactly, and the one thing that some people don't realize about horror as well is there doesn't need to be a true defining creature, villain of the story, because the characters that are in the situation themselves are the ones driving the narrative.
Exactly. So, I know a lot of people will think, well, Godzilla's horror. You have a giant monster. And yes, that's correct. Same thing with Thing. You have an alien. And you could even go with Cabin in the Woods. You have that supernatural element. And yes, there are going to be aspects of that. But think of like Think of Identity.
Yeah,
we were actually just talking about that recently with John Cusack.
Australian horror movie Babadook is another good one.
Yes. There is in those types of films, and not to really spoil it, but they're psychological in elements. And at the end of it all, that's what makes a great horror movie. It could make a great horror movie, book, song, television show is how visceral it is, how psychological it is. It could be the dumbest thing in the world, but if it has a good narrative in that horror element, it can really play with your psyche. Even Blair Witch Project, if you think about that for a movie, which created the found footage genre, that's a terrible horror movie.
It truly is, but the characters play off each other so well.
Absolutely. And the isolation, which is another thing that's great in anything horror, no matter what it is. And I know we keep on mentioning music, and if you think about music, what is very close, because there actually are horror bands out there for horror rap, horror metal, horror anything. If you want like an easier explanation for horror, sometimes it's more of the death metal, death rap that you get.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, Finland actually has a band called Lordi. They dress up as horror monsters, perform on stage, and all their songs for their music videos have a horror theme to them. Admittedly, most of them are pretty comical, but still, that just goes to show that people love this stuff and eat it up.
Well, and it's what draws you in. That's why I've always enjoyed books like from Stephen King, Dean Koontz, Clive Barker. Even if we go to comic books, Neil Gaiman is great when it comes to writing horror narratives. Same thing with all the writers at Zenescope.
Yeah. And even Neil Gaiman, when he's not writing horror comics, he interjects horror in his regular novels as well, and it works even that way, even if it's not a horror novel.
And the reason why we wanted to talk about what this means about you personally, if you enjoy horror, or even if you don't enjoy horror. There are a lot of people, but then again, kind of backtracking from that, there are a lot of people who say they don't enjoy horror. And then when you mention a random film, like Cabin in the Woods,
The Thing,
or if you go on a television show, let's say, Black Mirror.
Oh, yeah.
It's not in-your-face horror, and some people forget that horror does not have to slap you in the face with gore. Horror is all about the storytelling.
Yeah, exactly, and some people don't realize that some science fiction movies are actually horror, even some TV shows. Orphan Black is a prime example of a sci-fi show with clones that you don't really realize its underlying plot is very horror-esque.
And so, why horror as a genre can tell you a lot about yourself is it can tell you how you handle complex situations, how you handle fear, how you understand the elements of shock, surprise, or even how comfortable you are with very extreme and very difficult situations.
Yeah.
Horror is, admittedly, if you go into true horror, no matter which medium you like, depending on the type of horror you enjoy, can really tell you how you process information. I would say sometimes on equal paths of sci-fi, because sci-fi is very complex, especially when it comes to the written storytelling, or in the movie version, because that's such a short impact in your face experience.
Exactly. Look at your reaction if you're seeing like Saw, or if you're going and playing any video games like Last of Us or Resident Evil. What is your mental processing when you're playing or watching this, going through the complex narrative that's taken through those?
Like, a lot of people will look at the negative path. I don't want to really go into the element of, so to speak, school shootings, but unfortunately we do have to kind of start there on what it tells you about you on a negative side. So if you think about it, unfortunately for Columbine, which I had graduated high school at that point, that kind of ages me, but I was just out of high school, probably about a year, 2 years, and many of the things that were talked about for the two young men, because they are no longer with us, which justifiably so.
Yeah. Especially somebody like me who has family that went to Columbine, was just entering high school the year it happened.
Absolutely. So it's a terrible situation. But the reason why I bring that up first is because I want to focus real quick on the darker side of what horror can tell you. And this is because both of those individuals were obviously it's conjecture because we weren't with them, but they liked horror-inspired music, horror-inspired video games, horror-inspired television shows. And so a lot of people do give it this negative connotation that anything horror is bad because it's creating this extreme reaction. It's taking this negative thing, because horror usually does include a lot of negative. It's not uplifting. And it's putting it into an extreme situation.
But when you think about it, that's just going to be maybe a fraction of 1% of people are going to have this. Unfortunately, the media likes to focus in on that one lone extreme.
And what it can tell you about yourself if you feel any violent tendencies. Unfortunately, that is that is not a necessity. That is an aspect of horror, just like it is any genre. The question is, can you separate yourself from what is being viewed? Do you see yourself as Jigsaw in the Saw movies? Do you see yourself as the hero in the Saw movies? I know there's really no tried and true hero, but Mark Wahlberg was trying to be one.
Danny Glover was trying to be one.
Exactly. So, but it's, do you see yourself in the shoes of the killer, or do you see yourself in the shoes of the people who are trying to survive, who are trying to become better than what they may currently be?
It'll also tell you, do you have a fight or flight fancy?
Absolutely. Because a lot of people who don't like horror, and this is not a negative towards those individuals, but more often than not, they do have a higher flight persona to them. They cannot handle very extreme circumstances, and that's a big part of why I enjoy horror. I enjoy it because of the storytelling first and foremost, but it really does explain, what are your boundaries? What are you comfortable with? Because in this life that we live, be it short, be it long, is we have to deal with some extreme circumstances. And just like any other fandom that may be out there, a lot of people do utilize this as a release.
Yeah.
I know I personally, I do.
For me, it's basically my release from stress.
Exactly. And look at it as entertainment. And that's one thing that you have to be sure about, that what horror can tell you about yourself. Do you look at it as entertainment? Do you look at it as escapism? Do you look at it as a way of seeing the world in different colored glasses? Because a lot of people I've talked to that enjoy horror do look at as the aspect where they can kind of look at the extreme situations that can occur in horror movies that don't occur in true reality, and enjoy it for that fantasy. And it tells them that they need that chance to escape, that they need that chance to just break that boundary. I think that's why you enjoy horror so much.
Yeah, I love it. My horror tastes are overlap with yours at times, but also mine are in that very different, because I really love the psychological horror of mind breakdown and just how people are going to interact with each other from that aspect. And then I enjoy creature feature more than I enjoy slasher.
I've always enjoyed like slasher, psychological, supernatural. And the reason what horror tells me about myself is that I need that break. It's not really an escapism, because I enjoy it because it makes me think, or it makes me laugh, or it makes me feel like I'm human in a way. There are sometimes for different types of individuals, and this can be for any genre, but specifically for horror, a lot of horror fans use it as almost like a warm hug. I know that sounds very sick when you think of the type of genre that you're looking at for anything related to horror, but it can tell you that you just need a little extra comfort, that reality or other genres, because comedy, if you put it into that realm, comedy is just, it is that. It's there for quick laughs. It's there for memories, because yes, people remember Spaceballs and so many other films, but there's something visceral about horror that can stay with you much longer.
Exactly.
At times.
And for me, why I love the psychological and thriller style horror so much is just because I love a good mystery story, and a lot of those type of horror movies are like a mystery that you're watching break down, and just the character interactions you're watching as they are trying to figure out the same puzzle you are trying to figure out, because you and the characters in that story are getting the same clues at the same time, and just trying to break that down.
And so, with that said, I think it's important to remember that horror genre, I know we keep on saying movies, it's just sometimes movies are so much more common for people, because a lot of people may not read books as often as they'll watch a movie, or they'll pick up a video game or things like that. My recommendation, if you want something that's incredible that is horror related, is I would look at any of the classic radio shows from the 40s and 50s, like The Haunting Hour or The Whistler, or there's so many others. If you think what we have in current movies or current books, especially with Neil Gaiman or Gaiman or whatever,
Dean Koontz, even with a lot of his more recent stuff.
Absolutely. Same thing with Stephen King. He's been very hit or miss, and I know a lot of people are looking at the It sequel just to see how that gets created.
And then Clive Barker still is producing material, which people seem to forget.
Oh, Clive Barker. I've always enjoyed his works. But listen to those classic radio shows from the 40s and 50s. You'd be amazed. For an era that doesn't have technology, that doesn't have all the intricacies of what we have today, their storytelling when it comes to anything horror really can play that psychological element. They can play that thriller element. And it's something that's been so impactful in our culture as human beings since, I would say, the dawn of time. If you look at a lot of the ancient stories from the Greeks, having the Gorgons, having Arachne, all of those stories, same thing with all of the Norse kind of lore and everything like that. There's so much out there that demonstrates that horror is needed to have that balance, and it tells you a lot about yourself. Are you comfortable with that balance? are you comfortable with fear? And not just the flight or fight aspect of fear, but just comfortable with fear, understanding yourself that there are bad things that are going to come your way, and having something like horror can really just give you that chance to equalize it and be able to stand tall from it.
Yeah, another aspect of horror, it makes you actually think about your own mortality, because you're looking at these characters and like that could be me, whether it's like a torture porn or even just the psychological aspect movies. And one of my most favorite psychological and probably one of the most underrated horror movies, Event Horizon. That is one of the true that just touches on mortality, science gone wrong, and the psychological breakdown of humans that are just locked on a ship in space that can't contact anybody. Another film that does it very well, the original Alien.
The original Alien, and that's a big thing about horror, anything, even when it comes to books. Thinking about Alien, I'm thinking of like an early Stephen King novel. Think of The Stand. That is an incredibly long book, but it's well worth the read if you don't mind sitting out there for probably about 20 hours to read 800 pages. But it really helps you find isolation, but it also helps you find hope. That's one thing I think a lot of people also forget about anything in the horror genre. Yes, you're not going to have a happy ending many times, which is fair, because if you think about it in reality, you never have a happy ending unless you make it for yourself, unless you work at it for yourself. But horror in general as a genre can tell you one thing about yourself that no other genre can do, and that's how much hope are you willing to give. Because even with the drama movies, when you think of like the Stars in Our Skies or something about that young...
Oh yeah, I know which one you're talking about.
The one, it's the film that has one of the characters that's dying of cancer.
Both of them are dying of cancer.
Oh yeah, A Fault in Our Stars, that's what it's called. But that movie, while it shows a lot of positivity as a film, or even as a book, unfortunately I haven't seen either, but I've just read a lot of reviews on it. The challenge for me is those types of movies, they're manufactured to give you hope, but they push the hope in a matter that when you look at the horror genre of any medium, you have to find the hope in what you're reviewing. Because thinking of Alien to be specific, or even going with The Stand, they don't see any hope. They persevere, they try to fight for it, but at the end, even though it's not a happy ending, they're hopeful because they have demonstrated their need for survival.
Exactly. And then when you look at it through one of my favorite video games that's come out in the last 10 years, The Last of Us, it's showing that the creatures that have taken over as the zombie plague may not be the true villains of the story. It's the other humans that you're forced to have to survive with are actually the more monstrous people out there. And how are you going to survive knowing that your fellow human out there may not be looking out for you?
Absolutely. And I think, though, another thing for me that I love about the horror medium is being in my career path of human resources and working with people. Horror has actually helped me in different ways as an individual. It's made me understand the different types of people that are out there. I understand sometimes a lot of the characters in any of the mediums, or even in the music, are hyper realized or hyper focused. But there's some true elements that really give you an idea of the type of people that you may be interacting with in your day-to-day lives, that it almost gives you a chance to kind of identify and evaluate how would you handle those individual situations, not obviously in the terrible ways they may do in anything horror, but you can kind of backtrack it and take it from that big picture of whatever medium and put it into like a regular day-to-day.
Yeah, the one thing that horror, anything, except for the music, but I will say video games, TV shows, movies, have excelled at doing is really grouping the personality types very well in the actual people you will encounter in real life.
Oh, yes.
Because every type of personality is going to react different to that situation that they're thrown into. And just knowing that and looking back at that lens, you're going to understand, okay, that person's going to more than likely react to the situation this way if I end up making this kind of response.
Yes, and that's the one thing that I love about horror, is it really does give you that chance to understand your fellow man. And personally, I have to say, I love horror. It is one of my favorite genres for anything. Not that I discount all the other genres, because that's not the point of being a horror fan, but it's to really respect it for what it is. And there have been many times in my life, even still now, because I suffer from severe depression, severe anxiety, which is kind of ironic to think I'm using something as impactful with adrenaline as horror. But it does help me because I'm able to not focus on my own personal situations. And this is what it does for me, is I'm able to focus on an external source, and I can kind of take my stress, take my anxiety, take any depression, and put it on those characters. And for me, at the end of the day, that's what I need. And that's what I think anybody should have of any genre. I really do feel that horror is a great genre that can equalize that, but no matter what it is, you want that type of experience with whatever genre you like.
Exactly. And going into this now, for some people, there are a few recommendations I have for people that love horror but may have not checked these out that are personal favorites of mine. I've already talked about Last of Us for video games, which, if you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend you do. Another video game, the second Silent Hill game, is probably one of the best examinations of a human psyche I have ever seen in a video game.
Oh, yes.
Especially the main character's breakdown. And there's hundreds of spoilers out there on what he did to lead him down that path online, but try not to go out and look for those. Personal favorite books of mine, Christine from Stephen King and The Stand, as Cruellica's talked about. Those are really, really good. Justine Musk has only released 3 books physically, and then most of her other books and short stories are digitally. Check out her writing. She's done a very good story. It's about psychological impact with demons and stuff. On the TV side, there are pretty much only one show that's come out that I've truly, truly enjoyed under the horror genre over the last few years, but I'd recommend going and reading the manga instead with Tokyo Ghoul. It's the interactions between the characters and the fact that if you go into it kind of ignores the second season of the anime, assuming you've read the manga. And for movies, Event Horizon, the original Alien are 2 of my favorite. The Thing is another good one for psychological. I enjoy The Babadook if you can get out there and watch it. What about you, Cruellica?
So, if I were to go on books, starting with them first, classic Stephen King, by far, is a great way of going. The Stand is a great psychological, as well as kind of supernatural, but more psychological with some supernatural elements. I would also go with even Rosemary's Baby. Rosemary's Baby, both the movie as well as the book, or even the miniseries that just came out a couple of years ago, is a great story of how a woman specifically copes with dramatic changes in her life, understanding people, understanding culture, understanding relationships. For Clive Barker, I really recommend, well, any of his books, but the Books of Blood series that were released, I believe, in the mid-'80s. They're kind of like vignettes throughout each of the books. And they take on supernatural, psychological, thriller, slasher. Each vignette takes on a different story. And it really helps to kind of enjoy that. Another book I really enjoy, even though I love the movie, the book is so much better. And that's actually The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. Or Blatty. B-L-A-T-T-Y.
I think it's Blatty.
But if you don't like the movie, which I can certainly respect, I know many people who don't like the Exorcist movie from the 70s, the book is much more extreme, and it takes so many different elements that the movies do not, that can help. When it comes to video games, I do agree with what Advent Nebula said. Last of Us, Silent Hill, I would say the first two Resident Evil games, they're more of the zombie orientation for horror games, but they still do have that psychological element, especially because it's playing with the isolation. Especially the first one, you are very limited on your actions. You're very limited on what you can do. And I think for a video game, or even anything of the sort, that isolation certainly helps. If I go on modern movies, I would say the first two Conjuring movies. The reason I say first two is because there's a third coming out, so I can't credit that one yet. Both of those, even if you take out the real life elements that you have to kind of give a grain of salt to, it's still such a wonderful, they're so wonderful in filmmaking and storytelling and presentation.
Looking right there at your list there that you have pulled up, The Witch is another one that I would rank up there really well as a modern horror. And think about it too, one I didn't mention, A Quiet Place was by far probably one of the best horror movies I've seen in the last couple of years.
A Quiet Place, for, I would say, all levels of horror, was a fantastic film because it's not isolation in location, it's isolation in sound. And if you look at classic horror movies, well, we've talked about The Thing and different things like that, I would go with Psycho. Psycho is by far one of the best psychological slasher horror movies that have ever existed, because it takes you on a journey and you're looking at it from three different people's perspective. Two sisters and a son. And I leave very little context in how that family dynamic is distributed, because you really have to watch the movie. If you've seen the movie, you understand what I mean, two sisters and a son. But it's a great film. Anything by Alfred Hitchcock is typically great in my opinion.
Hitchcock has mastered the art of psychological storytelling, whether or not it's horror. I mean, Psycho's amazing, and then Rope is probably one of my single favorite Hitchcock movies, and people don't realize it kind of is a crime drama sprinkled with a dash of horror in there just after the deed has been done.
And another film that I would certainly recommend as a great horror movie, but also a great narrative of our world at this time. And while we always think that the world is so different than it should be, it exists, is probably Get Out. And I know I'm a white person recommending this movie, but it really does hold true. And sadly, I have to say, as a white person, to see this to other human beings, because that's not fair, it really does go into classism when you think about the wealth of one individual versus the other. It goes in racism. It goes into so many different elements that I would have never in my time thought a horror movie would have done, and done well, without mocking or making a specific race or making a specific culture look like a true villain.
Yeah.
While there are villains of this movie, and if you've seen it, you can all agree there are villains of this movie, but the villain is also, in my opinion, the way the world acknowledges the differences, that it kind of ignores it due to classism.
Exactly. And then if you're looking at just like something you just want to kind of bounce into and doesn't have any kind of overarching arc for like a TV show, you can't go wrong with classic Outer Limits, Tales from the Crypt, or if you're
Twilight Zone.
Yep, Twilight Zone. Or if you're looking for like a more modern, Black Mirror and Philip K. Dick's Electric Sheep are both ones you can there look at as well.
Or another story that also takes on the trip of family that I think is a great narrative of just how depression, how mental illness in general, along with drug abuse, and just supernatural elements, but sometimes there's supernatural elements of the mind that may not actually exist. And I would look at the Netflix series Haunting of Hill House. It's about 10 episodes, and it's a great television series that I honestly never thought I would enjoy, because it does go in a very dark and in-your-face context. But sometimes you need that to even tell you about yourself, of you can see this happen, but it will be okay.
Yeah.
That's where the hope comes in.
Yeah, that is probably the most no holds bar of anything that's come out on Netflix for their horror options recently.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because it really does slap you in the face. And on a happy note with regards to a horror thing, so we can wrap this up, is if you've watched the most recent episode of Black Mirror, which has Miley Cyrus, which I have to admit, she's always been a great actress, so I can't complain. And she is a good musician, good, bad, or otherwise. Watch the episode, and in the comments section, if you don't know it already, tell me the song that she is actually referencing, because even though he's not horror, he definitely has those elements.
And with that, we are going to be stepping out of the therapy chair until our next episode. I'm Advent Nebula.
I'm Cruellica Kain. Bye!